Shalom. In Parashat Tazria Metzora, the Torah deals extensively with the issue of Tum'a v'tahara. Now, there's a very basic issue that relates to Tum'a v'tahara, which I'd like to examine here with the help of Abarbanel. Let's begin with a well-known midrash, which actually appears in several places in the midrashic literature. The midrash tells the story of a Gentile who came to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and he wanted the rabbi to explain to him what is Tum'a. What is Tum'a v'tahara? In particular, the Gentile was perturbed by the issue of Tumat Meit and the purification with the help of the Para Aduma. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was familiar with this Gentile and his cultural background, so he said to him, I'm sure you know the phenomenon of a ruach tizazit. Ruach tizazit, it's an evil spirit which sometimes possesses somebody, and the evil spirit has to be exorcised, and you bring various herbs and potions to make the evil spirit go away. So think of this process of purification of Tum'a in the same way. It's kind of we're making an evil spirit go away. So the Gentile left, but after the Gentile left, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was left with his Talmidim, and the Talmidim, you can imagine them drumming their fingers and saying, well, Rabbi, what you said is good enough for this non-Jew, but how do you explain this matter to us? And the revered teacher said as follows, Chayechem lo hamet metamei v'lo hamayim metaharim el gzerato shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Chukah chakakti gzera gazarati ve'en ata rashai lavor al gzerati. In other words, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was taking the position that Tum'a is not really an objective reality, but it's a kind of a halachic construct. It's something which comes into existence as a result of the legislation of the Torah, but it's not really there in the objective world, physical, so to speak, the physical spiritual world. Now, I think we can see from the way Abarbanel discusses Tum'a and Tahara throughout these Parshiot of Tazria and Metzora, we can see that he does not agree. For example, he asks the following question: why does the Torah deal at such length with tzarat? There are plenty of contagious diseases. Why does the Torah feel that tzarat is the one that has to be discussed and legislated and given guidance how to deal with it, how to identify it? And his answer is that it's true that there are many diseases, but tzarat apparently is the one which has Tum'a in it. In other words, it's not only a physical disease, but it's also a disease with Tum'a, and that Tum'a spreads when other people are exposed to the Metzora. And the Torah was concerned about the spreading of this Tum'a. In other words, the Torah is not creating the Tum'a of the Tzarat when it legislates the laws of Tzarat. The Torah is actually taking a thing which exists in the real world, that is the Tum'a of the Tzarat, and telling us how to deal with it, how to identify it, how to react to it, and how to eventually guide the Metzora through his refuah. Okay, we'll see more of this as we view more of what the Abarbanel has to say about the Tum'a and Tahara. But I would add that there's another issue related to Tum'a v'tahara, which is an outgrowth of the one which I just mentioned. The question which we can ask is the Torah actually opposed to ritual Tum'a? Or is Tum'a basically a neutral phenomenon? And the problem with Tum'a is contextual. In other words, you can't go into the Beit Mikdash when you're Tum'a. You can't eat holy food when you're Tum'a. But other than that, if you don't come into contact with these holy objects or these holy places, it's okay to become Tum'a. And if you're Tum'a, you don't have to purify yourself. It's perfectly all right. I think most of us think of it this way, experientially by ourselves, because as we all know, we all have Tum'a today, and we don't feel that it in any way impinges on our moral personality, on our ability to serve Hashem. And this is really the dominant viewpoint among Rishonim, such as the Rambam and the Kuzari. They all say that being Tum'a is not really a problem unless you have to encounter something which is kadosh. In other words, Tum'a is opposed to kedusha, but when you lead your normal profane life, you don't have to worry about Tum'a too much at all. But on this, Abarbanel does not agree. There are certain psukim in these parshiyot of Tazria and Metzora which can be interpreted as supporting the first view. For example, the Torah says in the case of the woman who gave birth, "B'chol kodesh lo tiga ve'al mikdash lo tavo ad klot yemei taharata." In other words, the woman cannot go into the mikdash or touch anything which is holy unless she has purified herself. But as long as she doesn't want to go into the mikdash, as long as she doesn't want to touch anything that's holy, apparently there's no problem. Likewise, in the pasuk, which seems to sum up all these laws of Tum'a and Tahara, "V'zatem et b'nei Yisrael mitumatam v'lo yamutu b'tumatam b'tam'am et mishkani asher b'tocham." In other words, the Torah seems to be warning us that you shouldn't be mitamei et hamikdash through the Tum'a. In other words, you can't go into the mikdash. Once again, if you're not going to the mikdash, there's no problem. However, Abarbanel, in interpreting this last pasuk which I quoted, he says as follows: "V'ma yitbarach leMoshe u'lAaron v'yizartem et bnei Yisrael mitumatam kadei shelo yamutu b'tumatam v'lo amar zeh al tumat haguf u'mitato." Right? When the Torah says they shouldn't die in their Tum'a, the Torah doesn't mean that they should die, that they shouldn't die physically. Ela al hanefesh hamaskelet, ulezeh amar b'tam'am et mishkani asher b'tocham, hu shechinat hakavod, hu b'nefesh hakdosha, v'chein u'b'tocham Hashem, ki Hashem Elokecha mitalech b'kerev machanecha, v'haya machanecha kadosh, v'yireh b'cha ahavat davar v'shav mi'acharecha. Right? This is a pasuk in Sefer Vayikra, which has a specific context, but Abarbanel here brings it as a general pronouncement on the negativity of Tum'a. Namely, that Tum'a contaminates the soul, or in the language of the present pasuk, it kills the soul, it kills the spiritual soul, it kills the mental soul. And this is due to the fact that Shechinat hakavod hu b'nefesh b'tam et mishkani asher b'tocham. Right, we're not talking about the physical mikdash. We're talking about the mikdash of Hashem, which dwells within the person, which dwells in the soul of the person and in his heart. In the light of this statement of Abarbanel, we can see first of all that he considers Tum'a as something which really exists in the world. And secondly, that he views it as something which endangers by its very nature the wholeness of the person's spirit, because it confronts kedusha. We can think of Tum'a as the converse of kedusha. What is kedusha? Kedusha is a quality which Hashem created in the world, and it exists in the natural world, but it also exists and can be engendered in actions that human beings perform. Likewise, there is Tum'a in the world. Tum'a is an actual manifestation of an obstruction to Kedusha, something which opposes Kedusha. And this, according to Abarbanel, in his lengthy interpretation of Tazria and Metzora, this can be created either through some physiological problem, some breakdown of an intricate physiological mechanism, but it also can be engendered by sin, by a lapse in the person's conduct or a person's being, which in turn can create a breakdown of the physiological perfection in the world, and this can create Tum'a. So, for example, as a case of something which appears to not have been caused by sin, a woman who gives birth. So there's a special Tum'a associated with childbirth. Why is that? So Abarbanel explains, because the normal cycle of bleeding of the woman has been interrupted, has been stopped during the pregnancy, and that causes a buildup of roughage and waste and blood within the woman, and that suddenly is released in the childbirth, and that gives us this kind of breakdown of the normal course of events, gives us a state of Tum'a. But on the other hand, which the case which Abarbanel perhaps emphasizes more, is the Tum'a which comes about as a result of the lapse of the human being's conduct, or something that has to do with the human's performance, which creates this Tum'a. So, for example, if we take the case of a Zav, right, a person who has this disease which we call today gonorrhea. Now, this is a physiological breakdown as well, but the reason for this Tum'a, Abarbanel says, is because this disease, as we know today, and Abarbanel concurs, is created or is spread primarily because of sexual promiscuity or sexual excess. And he actually says that for this reason, the Torah requires a korban. A salient feature of some of these serious cases of Tum'a is that the Torah requires a sacrifice to be brought at the final stage of the Tum'a. Now, this sacrifice could be interpreted simply as perhaps a rite of passage. A re-entry into the holy precinct, the ability to enter the mikdash, requires that you bring a korban. But Abarbanel tends to view these sacrifices as things that have existential significance to the person who brings the sacrifice, just like any sacrifice is. And so he says, this person who is a Zav, on the assumption, of course we can't be actually definitely sure, but on the assumption that in all probability this disease attacked him because of his own promiscuous conduct, and therefore he should bring this korban to aton for what he did. However, Abarbanel says, since we don't know for sure that he's to blame, so he only brings a small korban, right? He brings birds, not an animal. Abarbanel, of course, also lays great emphasis on what Chazal say about tzarat, that tzarat is something which Hashem brings in response to the person's bad behavior, his antisocial behavior, for example, his lashon hara, or other things that he does. Even though Abarbanel was aware that it could be that he got the tzarat not for this reason. It could be that, right, he says, for example, that he believes that the Torah preceded the story of the tzarat with the story of the childbirth, because there are people who, by the circumstances of their birth, they have this predilection, they have this propensity, this danger of contracting tzarat. Right? If the woman conceived while she was unclean, while she was not perhaps punctilious in keeping all the laws of Tum'a and Tahara, so then the child that is born will have this predilection to contract tzarat. So it could be that that's also a natural thing. But in any event, Abarbanel definitely does think that the Torah is kind of legislating against the spread of Tum'a, even though there's no actual prohibition on becoming Tameh, because these things can happen. We know death is part of life, and it's very hard to prevent the event of Tum'a from happening. But the Torah does go into great length in order to make us careful and try to avoid Tum'a as much as possible. And when it occurs, it gives us the tools in order to purify ourselves. So then Abarbanel is taking a stance which is contrary to I think the majority view of Rishonim. And if we ask ourselves, what's at issue here? What's at stake? What are they actually arguing about? I believe that the fundamental question here is, how do we define the central spiritual mission of the person or of the Jew? What are the coordinates of the graph on which the person moves throughout his life as he makes his choices? Simply put, the graph is good versus evil. And every place that he moves on this graph, he has to try to do the good thing, or as much as possible, draw near to the good and distance himself from the bad. What about Kedusha? Where does Kedusha figure in this? Well, Kedusha is not on the chart. Kedusha is a summit. It's a paramount value, which is very hard to achieve, something not expected of the ordinary person in the ordinary profane life. And therefore, Tum'a, as a rule, is not a problem, because Tum'a, its basic definition is an obstruction to Kedusha, something which makes Kedusha stay away, which can't coexist with Kedusha. But what we expect from the ordinary person is that he be good, not that he be holy. Hanan Porat Zichrono Livracha, when he was at the end of his days, he said, "Ratziti liot tov," I wanted to be a good person. Right? That sounds like a very prosaic, very ordinary, moral aim, but something which is fitting for the average person. Of course, Hanan Porat was not an average person, but that's how he viewed himself. However, if we compare this to Rav Neria Zichrono Livracha, so he famously said at the end of his days, "Kedusha ani mevakesh, Kedusha ani mevakesh." In other words, the thing that was always drawing him in his spiritual life and being the challenge which he always tried to achieve, the goal was Kedusha. And whenever we say that a person has to be good and has to do the right thing, according to this view, basically what we are saying is he has to be constantly come as close as possible to Kedusha, that is, close as to the divine as much as possible. And when viewed in this way, Tum'a becomes a problem, because Tum'a is something which, as Abarbanel says, "Vayamach anecha kadosh v'lo yireh b'cha avat davar." Right? HaKadosh Baruch Hu does not coexist. The Kedusha which stems from Hashem cannot coexist with Tum'a. So Abarbanel, from this perspective, is in the camp of Rav Neria, not of Hanan Porat. I just in closing will say that this is another example of Abarbanel taking a concept which is something which is elitist, which is considered by many to be something which is not the ordinary person cannot achieve. And according to Abarbanel, this becomes a dominant part of our religious life and our spiritual life, and it really is expected to be seen as a challenge which speaks to everyone. We saw this in the past with Ahavat Hashem when Abarbanel spoke about Tefillah in Parashat Tzav. We're seeing the same thing here now about Kedusha in the case of Tazria Metzora, where basically Abarbanel is saying the reason that the Torah deals at such length with Tum'a is because the Torah expects us to be Kedoshim. So as opposed to the view of what I claimed was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's approach, that Kedusha is something which certainly not even a physical reality, but in any event, not something which is a challenge for the ordinary man. But Abarbanel says that if you look at the pshat of the psukim, the fact that the Torah speaks at such length about the Tum'a and Tara means that the Torah does think that this is something which we have to take to heart, and something which should be our guiding light throughout our spiritual lives.